up Catholic in Rome, was a genetic kind of believer, but pretty much I accepted the general notion. At an early point in my life, I was a teenager. I discovered philosophy. I was taught philosophy in high school in Italy, and that really did it for Catholicism. It's like, no, this is not a thing. So that was the first transition, and I transitioned into something normally referred to as secular humanism. I mean, atheism is an ontological negative position, right? I don't believe in God, or I don't believe in the supernatural. You don't get any kind of positive philosophy of life out of that. You just get to have these provisional truths, the best understanding of what's going on as we have been able to formulate it up to this point. But there's always the possibility to improve. There's always the possibility you could be wrong about a number of things and you might need to revise them. Hopefully your revisions are going to be minor, but occasionally they might be major. But sometimes it's just throw the whole thing out and say, okay, now time to start from true that today we use sophisticated instruments like telescopes and microscopes and particle accelerators. But at the end of the day, you have to look at the results, or you have to hear the results. So it still comes down to your senses. And then, of course, to your ability to reason about what your senses. Everybody has a philosophy of life, whether they know it or not. You act in a certain way for certain reason. You have certain values, whether they're stated or implied. You have certain priorities, whether stated or implied by your behavior. So that to me amounts to a philosophy. And you have a general view of the world. You have a general conception of how the world works and what your place in the world is. That's a philosophy of life. Whether you give it a name specifically or not, whether you realize it or not, that is a philosophy of life.
Welcome again to the show. Today we've got a great guest, Massimo Pigliucci. Massimo, how are you doing?
Doing good, despite the heat wave that is, going through Europe at the moment. But we'll deal with it. It's outside of our control, of course.
Exactly. It's a little bit getting adjusted to the new climates that we have. Maybe created.
That's right.
But that's something for a different conversation altogether.
Yes.
But thank you for being on the show again. And last time we talked about your previous book, Beyond Stoicism, and How to Be a Stoic, two of my favorite books. So thank you for writing those and for sharing them. But for people who don't know Massimo is a professor of philosophy at the City College in New York. Before he was an evolutionary biologist. And he's written, I think, about closely to 100 papers, if I remember correctly. I was fortunate enough. Yeah, you mentioned
actually close to 200.
Oh, close to 200. Okay.
Not that I need to brag.
No. But I thought you mentioned something. I think it was something with 93, close to that. But I think you
Correct.
were. Yeah,
Correct.
Because it was great we met a few weeks ago actually in Turin at one of your seminars, which was again a fantastic experience for me to just talk to people about philosophy and about the new book, and that's what we're gonna talk to you about as well, about how to be a happy skeptic. And again, thank you for being on, and we'll get right started with the first question. And I wanted to kind of connect those three books that I've mentioned before. You've written How to Be a Stoic, really making the teachings of Epictetus something practical, using your personal examples. And you wrote Beyond Stoicism, which is an eclectic book with all these different philosophies and more or less like a manual to guide people to create their own philosophy of life, right? With practices at the end of each chapter. And you've written that together with Gregory Lopez and Meredith Alexander Kuntz, which was a great read. And the start of this book, How to Be a Happy Stoic, starts with it's I guess like a chapter about the importance of having a philosophy of life. And I completely agree. Like Stoicism is something that guides me, but I hope that people get inspired to create their own philosophy of life, because I think it's really important for to find a better life. But I wanted to ask you two questions on that. Is like, how would you describe your personal philosophy of life, and why do you think it's important for people to have a philosophy of life?
Yeah, great questions. So my philosophy of life has been evolving, of course, throughout my life, because you have experiences. You start out when you're young, you don't really know crap. Even though you might think you do. And then little by little, life teaches you something if you're paying attention, because, there are people who just get old and cranky without getting any wiser because they're not paying attention. But if you are paying attention, you kind of, learn one thing here and one thing there. And occasionally you might go through some kind of major change. Like this happened to me a couple of times in my life. first of all, I grew up Catholic in Rome. And so, was a generic kind of believer, but pretty much I accepted the general notion. And then at an early point in my life, I was a teenager. I discovered philosophy. I was taught philosophy, 3 years of philosophy in high school in Italy. And that really did it for Catholicism. It's like, no, this is not a thing. This is not going to happen. So that was the first transition. And I transitioned into something normally referred to as secular humanism, which is a version, it's a philosophical version of atheism. I mean, atheism is simply an ontological negative position, right? I don't believe in God, or I don't believe in the supernatural. Fine. But you don't get any kind of sort of positive philosophy of life out of that. You just get a negation. Secular humanism is really a philosophy for people who don't need the supernatural, who don't invoke the supernatural, whether it exists or not, doesn't matter really. And it's based on general principles such as, universal human rights, reliance on science and reason, and that sort of stuff. That's nice, and it's certainly okay for 20 years or so, up until the actual first crisis of my life happened, right? So you get to early middle age in my case, and things start happening, divorce and your father dying. Nothing that doesn't happen to other people. It's not like there was anything major, but nevertheless, those are challenges. And you think that if you have a challenge, then you go to your philosophy of life and you find tools to deal with that challenge. And to my disappointment, I guess, I didn't really find much of a toolkit within secular humanism. Again, I still agree. I still consider myself a secular humanist to some extent, in a broad sense of the term. And I still agree with the general principles. But when it came to actually, yes, but what did those principles tell me about how to deal with a divorce or my father dying? Is like the answer was, nah. So that's what got me into the current phase, basically, where I've been for a number of years, exploring philosophies of life that are rooted in virtue ethics. Because I really do think that whether you pick Stoicism or Aristotelianism or some other variation, or in fact, even some of the Eastern traditions like Confucianism have been described as kind of or very similar to virtue ethics. I think the answer really is virtue ethics in general. At least it has worked for me very well. It really has given me tools to try to improve myself and handle situations as life, gave them to me. So virtue ethics, the basic idea of virtue ethics is that you don't work on other people actions. You don't ask, well, is this thing right or wrong? What are they doing and all that. What you do is you work on your character, on your own ability to deal with things, right? So the word is virtue, as you know, although virtue does come from the Greek arete, which just means excellence. So you're trying to become the best human being you can. And now different schools, different Greco-Roman schools in particular, cashed out that general notion in different ways. So, what does it mean to be an excellent human being? Well, it may mean different things depending whether you are an Epicurean, for instance, or a Stoic. It sounds to me like the general group of philosophies that fall under the heading of Platonism, Aristotelianism, Cynicism, and Stoicism got it pretty much right. There are differences between these four. Some of these differences are actually major. So they're not, I'm not trying to say that they're all the same thing, but they all agree that the fundamental good in life is to live according to nature, by which, generally speaking, they mean human nature in the specific sense of an animal that is social and that is capable of intelligence. So especially the Stoics, to some extent, also the Cynics, but especially the Stoics, arrived at the conclusion that really a good life, a life worth living, is one in which you are as pro-social as you can manage. So as good and cooperative to other people as you can manage. And you try to solve your problems by way of reason. And that that resonated very much with me. I adopted that approach and I'm sticking with it. Now, you asked, however, yeah, but what are you now? Well, according to my last book, How to Be a Happy Skeptic, I'm a happy skeptic. But by which, however, I mean actually a skeptical Stoic. So the figure, we'll talk about it in a few minutes, presumably about the central figure of the book is Marcus Tullius Cicero, who was a Roman statesman statesman, advocate, public advocate, and philosopher. And he technically was a Platonist because he thought of himself as a member of the Platonic Academy during the so-called skeptical period. But in reality, most of his ethics, most of his general worldview actually came from the Stoics. He was very much inspired by the Stoics. So my model is, in fact, Cicero for additional reasons that we might explore in the next few minutes. Let me address your second question, which is why the hell is it important to have a philosophy of life? I think it's inevitable more than important. Everybody has a philosophy of life, whether they know it or not. You know, you act in a certain way for certain reason. You have certain values, whether they're stated or implied. You have certain priorities, again, whether stated or implied by your behavior. So that, to me, amounts to a philosophy. And you have a general view of the world. You know, you have a general conception of how the world works and what your place in the world is. That's a philosophy of life. Whether you give it a name specifically or not, whether you realize it or not, that is a philosophy of life. Now, most people automatically kind of by default adopt the philosophy of life that they grew up with, which usually means some kind of religious upbringing, right? In my case, Catholicism. Now, there are people, of course, who object, and I think rightly so, to make an equivalence between religions and philosophies, because religions tend to be based on revealed truths, while philosophies tend to be based on reasoned truths, right? And that is an important difference. I'm definitely in favor of philosophy of life. I don't think religion is generally speaking a good idea. But even so, both religions and philosophies of life belong to the same kind of general family of approaches. They both give you a general idea about the world and how it works, and they both give you a general idea of how to live in that world. So in answer to your question, I don't think that it's important. I think it's just essentially just happens. It's a thing when people have a philosophy of life, which means, however, that at least from time to time might be important for people to stop and ask themselves, is this philosophy of life actually working for me? Is it a good thing? As I said, I've done that a couple of times in my life in a major way. And then I keep doing it in minor ways pretty much every day. Every time that I write something for my Substack or if I read a book, then I'm basically asking myself questions and putting them out there so that people can help me answer those questions, or at least we can explore together what those questions mean.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful approach to it. As you said, everybody has a philosophy of life. So then maybe the question should be, what is a beneficial philosophy of life, right? Maybe how can it help you? And you talk about that in the book a little bit as well. And what do you think are the key ingredients for people who are listening and they are doing asking themselves those questions? Because your story kind of correlates with mine, raised as Catholic in the Netherlands. I actually, when I went to the Vatican, that was where I was like, this is not really my thing, where they sell all the water and all the things. Like, this feels more like a supermarket. I need something more like that's really my own. But what do you think are the key ingredients for philosophy of life? And from there, we can then, go into Cicero and the philosophy, the skepticism. But what do you think are the key ingredients?
I think there are three ingredients that you find pretty much in all or the great majority of philosophies of life, and in fact, again, also in religions. One is the metaphysics. In other words, understood broadly as a picture of the world, right? So if you're a Catholic, the world was created by a loving God who is all powerful, all good, and all that sort of stuff, and who loves you, right? If you're a Stoic, then the world is the result of forces of cause and effect. If you're an ancient Stoic, it also comes with a kind of a providential logos, a providential sort of sentience of some sort. If you're a modern Stoic, it probably doesn't. It just cause and effect, basically the scientific world. So, but that's a metaphysic. It's a picture of how the world works. Second, every philosophy of life has an ethics, which means a way for you to live within that world. So given the world as it is, what are you going to do? Well, again, if you're a Christian, then you're going to worship that God that created you and loves you. You're going to act in whatever way that God decides that it's proper to act. 10 Commandments, teachings of Jesus, that sort of stuff, right? If you're a Stoic, then you act in a way that improves your character, that is as cosmopolitan as possible. In other words, that treats everyone else on the planet as a brother and sister as much as it is humanly possible to do so, that kind of stuff. And then finally, the third component is some kind of practice. So all of this, you need a way to actually live your life, not just the principles that you follow, but sort of an actual way to live your life. So if you are a Christian, you go to church, you pray, you read scriptures, you volunteer for social causes, that sort of stuff. If you're a Stoic, you have a series of meditations. You engage in some kind of journaling to improve yourself. You act out the principles of cosmopolitanism and the four cardinal virtues of practical wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance, that sort of stuff, right? So once you put all these three things together, metaphysics, in ethics, and a set of practices, then basically you have a philosophy of life.
Nice. So there's a lot of, and this is good to have those kind of ingredients to be able to to break it down for people who are listening. It's like, okay, what does it mean? So how does it work? And I think that's a really, and you mentioned this as well in your book, and it's really clear. So for people, definitely read it, because again, this is more or less like, again, a guide to build it for yourself, right? A practice that comes to mind. And one interesting thing is, like, from my Catholic classes when I was at school, one priest said, you can be a good Christian and never go to church, or you can be a bad Christian and go to church every Sunday. It's how you practice it, right? So I think that last element of putting it into practice is really key with all of these philosophies, but you need to have the know-how. But during your journey from philosophy, you went your new currents phase, it's from Stoicism, and you added the skeptic part. How did that evolve, and how did you then decide, like, hey, I'm going to write a book about this, the happy skeptic, and use Cicero as the muse, if you will, or the narrator?
Yeah, writing books is something that I've been doing for a long time, for the simple reason that when I discover something that I think it's interesting to me, then I immediately think, oh, it might be interesting to somebody else. And that's one reason to write a book. The other reason to write a book is actually that you learn yourself a lot more by writing or by teaching. I am also, of course, a professional teacher. I am a professor, as you mentioned, at City College in New York. And you learn by teaching. Not in the trivial sense, these days it's, you hear a lot of people say, oh, I learn just as much from my students as I teach them. Well, then you're a bad teacher. If you're really on the same level with your students, I'm sorry, there is something that's not quite going right in there. But you do learn a lot from teaching, in part because you have, of course, to force yourself to explain as clearly as possible things to people who, in fact, are there to learn from you. And you sense immediately whether you're getting across or not. You can look at people's faces, and if the light bulbs go off, then great, you're making progress. If otherwise you get these blank stares, it's like, okay, obviously you're not getting through. The same thing goes for writing. I mean, I write books, and I write. I've been writing blogs or something like a blog from before the blog was a word. In fact, very early 2000. And part of the reason for that, again, is an exercise for me to figure out for myself what it is that I think or believe about certain things. So that's why I write. It's mostly an exercise in self-discovery, if you like, or in self-improvement. But it's also something that, my typical audience is myself a few years back when I didn't know anything about this stuff, right? So I think, what kind of book would I want it, a few years back when I actually started doing this thing, and then I write basically to a version of myself in the past to some extent. Now, the thing is, so where I am now is, as I said, as a sort of skeptical Stoic, but it's not like, you change your philosophy of life every other day, because that would make you very unstable and that would not be very practical. But I think that even when you do settle on a particular general area, like in my case, virtue ethics, and then eventually Stoicism, so you get a little more and more specific, basically, right? So a number of years ago, I realized, as I said before, that virtue ethics was pretty much the answer. But then I didn't know, well, does that mean Aristotle, Plato, the Stoics, the Cynics, or maybe even the Confucians or the Taoists or the Buddhists, because those philosophies also have some component or some aspect of virtue ethics. So you kind of zoom in and you say, okay, let me try. let me learn about these different things. And it turns out then I eliminated one by one a number of possibilities, and then eventually Stoicism struck me as the most practical, the one that really is aligned the most, not only with my own character, my own personality, but also, as I understand it, with the world at large. That said, there is also a danger of once you adopt something, whether it is a religion or a philosophy of life, then you kind of get stuck there, and you become dogmatic. You sort of say, okay, this is it. I'm a Stoic, so that's it. The end of the story, right? That's why I wrote this current book, because I think it's always a good idea to remind yourself that you don't necessarily have all the truths, and certainly not the truth with a capital T. What we have is provisional truths, the best understanding of what's going on as we have been able to formulate it up to this point. But there's always the possibility to improve. There's always the possibility you could be wrong about a number of things, and you might need to revise them. Hopefully your revisions are going to be minor, but occasionally it might be major. Sometimes it's just throw the whole thing out and say, okay, now time to start from scratch. So what kind of tools do you use for that kind of analysis? And I think skepticism, broadly construed, is the tool, is the approach. Now, in the ancient world, Greco-Roman world, there were two kinds of skepticism. Skepticism is not just a Western thing. You find philosophies that have strong components of skepticism in other traditions, especially in Indian philosophy, for instance. But if we stick to the Greco-Roman tradition, then there were two major schools of skeptics, and they were about contemporaneous, they were about simultaneous. The very first one to come out was what we refer to today as Pyrrhonism, after Pyrrho of Elis, who is a pretty mysterious figure. We don't really know much about him, other than he went with Alexander the Great in India during one of his expeditions, military expeditions, and he met a group of people that the ancient Greeks referred to as gymnosophists, which literally means naked wise men. We don't really know who those people were, possibly early Hinduists or Jainists or something like that. People have even suggested early Buddhists, but that's less likely. Whatever happened, Pyrrho was influenced by this encounter, and when he got back to Greece, he articulated a philosophy of a pretty radical skepticism. He basically said that there are two kinds of things in life. The things that are evident, that I don't really need to question in any kind of way. I just go along with it. Whether they're true with, again, the capital T or not, it's not really the question. It's just, I'm just going to do it. I'll give you an example in a moment. And then there is another set of things that are non-evident, and about those, the best thing you can do is to suspend judgment. Okay. So let me give you a couple of examples so that we know what we're talking about. An example of an evident thing is I'm talking to you using my tablet inside the office of a colleague of mine at Turin. I could doubt those things, right? I could start thinking about, okay, maybe I'm hallucinating. Maybe I took a hallucinogenic drug, or maybe I have a very high fever and I'm just imagining it. Sure. Is it possible? Yeah. Is it worth considering seriously? No. It's just, it's pretty obvious. This is what I'm doing. There's no need to sort of further philosophize on it. But the non-evident things are a large category, according to Pyrrhonists, are very important things. So all questions of ethics, is virtue the highest good in life, or is it pleasure, as the Epicureans were saying? So ethical questions, metaphysical questions, does God exist or not? Is there such a thing as the logos? That sort of stuff. Even, I would say, most advanced scientific questions, like, is the universe really made of strings, or is it particles, or is it fields, or is it whatever? All of those things, the Pyrrhonists said, don't bother, because those are, it's just as easy to come up with an argument in favor of one of those ideas as it is against, to come up with an argument against them. So the logical thing to do is to suspend judgment. Just like say, I don't know. And I'm not likely to know either. I just don't know, period. And they thought that suspending judgment about those things include, which by the way, include also politics. So is this political party, or is this policy better than this other one? Like, again, you can build an argument one way or the other. So you suspend judgment about all those things, and what that does is it brings you ataraxia, tranquility of mind. And they had a point. I'm not a Pyrrhonist, but they had a point, right? Because it is true that the questions that the kind of issues that I just listed, people very often attach a lot to those, right? I mean, political affiliation, religious affiliation, metaphysical views, maybe a little less scientific views, but even there, I've known scientists who were absolutely, attached to a particular view, and they seem to take it as a personal insult if you disagree with them, right? So the general notion is let all of those things go, engage in epoche, which is suspension of judgment, and your life will be smoother, basically. Okay, that's great. Unfortunately, I find those things that the Pyrrhonists say that we should let go among the most important things in life. So no, I'm not gonna let them go. It certainly would not bring me personally ataraxia, and so I said, nope, sorry. So then I went with the second school of skepticism, and that is the one that the book is really about. Even though I do talk about the Pyrrhonists, because you have to. When you're talking about skepticism, you have to give the sort of the general view. The academic skeptics. So they were called academic because, of course, they were members of Plato's Academy, although by the time Cicero was around, Plato was long dead. But the Academy had a very, very long history. It lasted over 900 years between the founding by Plato and its closing down by one of the Byzantine emperors after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So during that particular period, a period of several decades, I mean, a little bit more than a century, the Academy went through what is called the skeptical phase. And what does that mean? Well, the heads of the Academy during that period thought that we should go back, they should go back to the origins, to the beginning. And the beginning was Socrates, of course, right? So Plato, let's not forget, was one of Socrates' students. And of course, all of the early dialogues by Plato feature Socrates as a major character, right? And Socrates, you can argue, was in fact a skeptic because he claimed not to know much, if anything. He was always engaging in a quest to search for the truth together with other people. And the word skeptic comes from the Greek skeptikos, which means inquirer. So Socrates comes to mind. So the Platonists at that time had a point. It's like, look, Socrates was in fact a skeptic. We should go back to that. Now, over a period of decades, different scholars, different heads of the school, of course, went in different directions and built on this general idea of going back to Socrates. The most important one of which was a guy named Carneades, who was a direct influence on Cicero. Carneades thought, okay, but we can't just do like the Pyrrhonists, doubt everything, or suspend judgment. That's not helpful, because what are you going to do then when it comes down to actually making decisions? Act on things, right? Now the Pyrrhonists did have their own answers, and I go into that in the book, but I don't think we need to discuss it now. Carneades said, look, impressions, which are our immediate judgments of things that we see, we hear, we experience, and so on and so forth, are not all equal. They come in a variety of shapes and forms. Some impressions are barely convincing. So I might think that, yeah, sure, probably this is true, possibly this is true, but I don't feel very strongly about it. I don't see the evidence as being very strongly. For instance, if you were to say, I think that tonight in the sky of Turin, there will be an even number of stars instead of an odd one, right? I'd say, that's possible, but, I'm not going to bet anything on it, because it's pretty much 50-50. It's close to 50-50. However, then there are other impressions, Carneades says, that hit us as stronger. We have a sense that they're stronger than just what I just mentioned. So, for instance, there are some things that you say, yeah, I'm willing to bet a significant amount of money that this is true. I'm not positive. I'm not absolutely sure that this is true, but it sounds really convincing. So these are convincing kind of, persuasive kind of impressions. Then there is a higher level, a third level, which Carneades referred to as undiverted, meaning that not only it's a strong impression that if you find convincing, but it also does not contradict anything else you know about the world. Like, okay, well, now that's a pretty strong level of reliability. So I'm going to bet even more money on that one if I had to bet. And then finally, there is a fourth and highest level of impression, which is something that is not only strongly convincing, not only undiverted by other impressions, but thoroughly explored, as Carneades puts it. So basically, that people have actually spent a significant amount of time trying to figure out whether it's true or not. Think about scientific knowledge. Things that come out of scientific knowledge are thoroughly explored. So, for instance, am I confident that vaccines work? Yeah, very confident. Do I know that for absolute certainty? No, but I'm going to bet a lot in fact, I'm betting my life on the notion that vaccines work, right? So, because I am, in fact, that strongly convinced by it. So, Carneades thought that this kind of sliding scale that I just described constitutes a criterion for decision-making, which he called the pitanon. Pitanon in Greek just means essentially persuasive. So there's this different, you realize that that impressions come with different degrees of persuasiveness, and that we should act according to the degree of persuasiveness of an impression. So he's not a dogmatist. He's not saying this is true and this is false. He's not a Pyrrhonist. He's not saying, oh, I don't know, 50-50, I suspend judgment. He's saying, look, let's take a closer look. Some things are more persuasive than others, and so I'm going to act in proportion to that degree of persuasion. When Cicero read Carneades, he had the problem of translating the word pitanon in Latin, because Latin was a much simpler, initially at least, a much simpler language than Greek. And so several of the technical terms that the Greek philosophers used did not exist in Latin. And Cicero had to make up some of these terms. And so he translates pitanon as probabilis, which, of course, is where we get the English probability from, right? And that is, in fact, the first version of what we today call a theory of probability, not a fully quantitative version like modern probability theory is, not mathematically grounded and all that sort of stuff. But there is this very important intuition that impressions come with different degrees of persuasiveness, and that we should proportion our beliefs, as another great skeptic said it much later on, David Hume. He said, a wise person proportions their beliefs to the evidence, right? So depending on how much something is persuasive, then you say, okay, I believe it up to this point, or up to this point, or up to this point, right? So that to me is a fundamental breakthrough, because if you take it seriously, then it means that you're not going to go around saying this is true, this is not true, or this is true, this is false, because those are dogmatic statements. Those are too certain. That degree of certainty is not justifiable on the basis of human epistemic means. The academic skeptics realize that we have only two sources of knowledge: our senses and our reason. That's it. Everything else can be reduced to it. It's true that today we use sophisticated instruments like telescopes and microscopes and particle accelerators, but at the end of the day, you have to look at the results, or you have to hear the results, right? So it still comes down to your senses, and then, of course, to your ability to reason about what your senses tell you. Now, the skeptic said, yes, but the problem is that we know for a fact that both our senses and our reason may be fallible, right? They can get things wrong. And we don't know when they're fallible. By definition, when you don't know when you're wrong, because you don't realize it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be wrong. You'd be correcting yourself, right? And so this notion that human knowledge is fallible and is probabilistic in nature, I think, is a fundamental insight. Once you take it on board, then it colors everything else, including your philosophy of life, right? So I am a Stoic, but I realized that everything the Stoics said, the ancient Stoics said, or everything that modern Stoics may say, comes with the possibility of both fallibility and probability. Right? So every statement that I make about anything, including my personal philosophy of life, should be understood as, yes, but I could be wrong. And I hold this only with a high degree of probability, but not with certainty.
I think that that's a great approach to it, and to kind of connect that to the Stoic part as well as you ended, and you mentioned in one of your chapters, the fact finding, how to do that. It sounds like we need it more than ever. So I think your book is timely for the times that we're living in. But when you talk about the Stoics and the Skeptics, they felt like they were not as big of a rival as the Stoics and Epicureans, but they were still kind of debating each other. But how do you think that they would match up? And do you think that they were actually rivals, maybe even Cicero, as an example, could give us a clue there? Or how do you feel? What do you think about that?
Oh, that's a very good question. And in fact, that contrast you just made between the Stoics and the Epicureans on one hand, and the Stoics and the Skeptics on the other hand, is, I think, very telling. And so the Stoics and the Epicureans really disagree fundamentally about things, right? Even though on certain topics they actually do agree. I mean, Seneca famously often quotes favorably Epicurus in the early letters to Lucilius. So even the Stoics agree that sometimes the Epicureans got it right. For instance, the Epicurean view of death and why we shouldn't be afraid of death, it's basically invariant in Stoicism. The Stoics adopt exactly the same view. But the Stoics thought that the Epicureans are fundamentally wrong about the most important thing, which is what is the chief good in life. Right? For the Epicureans is pleasure, and specifically lack of pain, which they defined rather counterintuitively as the highest pleasure, right? Versus virtue, or being a good human being, pro-social, and using your intelligence to resolve problems. That's a fundamental distinction. Sometimes people ask me, why can I not be both an Epicurean and a Stoic? Well, you can't. I mean, if you like logical contradictions, go ahead, but you can't, because at one point, even though they agreed on certain things, and even though certainly we can learn from every pretty much every philosophical tradition, with very few exceptions, certainly we can learn from the Epicureans. But at the end of the day, if you ever find yourself in a situation where it's either going to be lack of pain or virtue, you have to choose. And if you choose the first one, you're an Epicurean. If you choose the second one, you're a Stoic. So that's why the Stoics were very critical of the Epicureans. So was Cicero. Even though he was, as I said, a Platonist, specifically a skeptical Platonist, he was definitely critical of the Epicureans. You see that very clearly, not only pretty much everywhere in all of his books. At some point or another, he mentions the Epicureans and he says, nah. But you see that most clearly in the Finibus Bonorum et Malorum, on the ends of good and evil, where the first two chapters, the first two books of that treatise are devoted to the Epicureans. And you can see what Cicero thinks of the Epicureans in that one. The second rivalry you mentioned between the Skeptics and the Stoics was really more kind of a in-house rivalry. That is, both the Skeptics, remember, again, they were Platonists, right? So both the Skeptics and the Stoics really did agree on the fundamentals. They agreed that virtue is the highest good, right? They disagree on other things. They disagree on issues of metaphysics. For instance, Platonists thought that the human mind has multiple components that are at war with each other. The famous metaphor that Plato uses of the charioteer and the two horses, that sort of stuff. While the Stoics thought that the human mind is a one thing, that emotions and reason are completely intermingled, that emotions have cognitive components, and that's why you can reason, so to speak, with your emotions, right? So there were differences, but they were within a certain paradigm, let's say, where the most important thing in life is, in fact, your virtue, your character. Nevertheless, there was a discussion, and that discussion went on for several decades between the Stoics and the Skeptics, and it was about epistemology. It was about their theory of knowledge, right? So the Stoics thought that the sage, at least, can have certain knowledge. So absolutely certain. The sage is not, remember, the sage is not a supernatural being, right? He's not a god. He's just a perfect human reasoner. He's a human reasoner who never makes mistakes about how to reason about things, which I think is conceivable. Whether there actually are any sages out there, even the Stoics were not sure, but at least it's conceivable. Somebody who is that good at reasoning that never makes mistakes. Okay, great. So the Stoics thought that the sage at least has access to the truth, that he will be able to figure out that an impression comes from kind of a mark of truth, basically, and it can be separated from impressions that are not necessarily true. The skeptic position was, no, even the sage is a human being. All human beings are fallible because, again, reason and senses, our reasons and our senses can go wrong. And so I'm sorry, the sage is not an exception. Now, the sage may be less likely to be wrong than other people if he's really a good reasoner, right? If he really thinks very carefully about the evidence, the impression, the facts, and so on. But nevertheless, he's going to make mistakes. And that debate went on for a while because Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoa, was one of those that strongly suggested that the sage actually has knowledge with a capital K. Carneades, the skeptic who I already mentioned, said no way, that's not a thing. And the thing went on back and forth. Now, Carneades actually lived a little after Chrysippus, so it was kind of a post-mortem debate to some extent. Diogenes Laertius, who's a commentator on ancient philosophy, in the seventh book of the Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, famously says that if it was not for Chrysippus, there would be no Stoa. That's a homage to Chrysippus. He basically recognizes that Chrysippus, who was a logician, made some such fundamental contributions to the Stoic philosophy that is just as important, if not even more important, than the founder of the school, Zeno, because basically what we today understand as Stoicism is Chrysippus' philosophy. So the phrase is, if not for Chrysippus, there would be no Stoa. Apparently, that phrase was well known in antiquity because Carneades uses it and turns it around into a quip. And he says, if it were not for Chrysippus, there would be no Carneades, meaning that he spent his whole life criticizing Chrysippus because he thought it was that important. So now, eventually, the debate ended with kind of a rapprochement, at least a partial rapprochement. That is, the Stoics, basically, the later Stoics kind of agreed that, well, the sage may occasionally have true knowledge, but most of the times he's going to suspend judgment. Because most of the time he's not going to be sure. He's not going to be positive about things. And the skeptics agreed with the Stoics that, look, certain impressions come with such a high degree of pitanon, or high degree of probability, that it doesn't make any sense to question them. For instance, I look outside of my window right now and it's 6 o'clock in the afternoon in Turin, so the sun is still out there because this is northern Italy. It would be really difficult for me to try to convince myself that it's the middle of the night. Right? It's like, no, it's not. Now, again, there's certainly the logical possibility that I could be sick or hallucinating or something like that. But no, not really. It's really sunny out there right now. So the debate ended with the Stoics kind of conceding some terrain to the skeptics and vice versa, which you would think it's actually a pretty reasonable way to end the debate.
Oh yeah, definitely. And although with the heat now, you don't need a hallucinogenic drug. It's just like sometimes, okay, is it really day or is it where are we living? But I think that, and thanks for explaining that in such a wonderful way. And that kind of segues into Cicero quite beautifully, because I feel like when you read and learn more about Cicero's life, you feel that kind of battle between him as well, right? Between the Stoics and the academics, and I think, and you want to add to that as well. I think, like, if you are really interested in Stoicism, then Cicero is someone you need to read, right? He might not be a Stoic,
Absolutely.
but he's one of the best sources of information about the philosophy that we have. But can you tell us a little bit first on, like, what inspired you and what made you write about Cicero, which I'm grateful that you did, because I got to read about Julius Caesar and all of those things. So I love that era of the history. And how do you feel that he fit in with all of this, the debate between the skeptics and the Stoics?
So Cicero is an it's a fascinating character for a number of reasons. First of all, he has had a huge influence throughout Western history. I mean, not only was very famous in his own time, of course, but he was well known by the early Christian fathers. Augustine even says that he converted to Christianity after reading one of Cicero's books, and he was brought to philosophy. Basically, he was attracted to philosophy because of that. He was very influential during the Renaissance. In fact, the Renaissance scholars think it pretty much started when the Italian poet Petrarch rediscovered some of Cicero's lost letters. He was incredibly influential during the Enlightenment. A lot of the Enlightenment thinkers used Cicero as a sort of point of reference, as an inspiration. And he was very well known and influential with the founding fathers of the American Revolution. So he's been literally always with us for 2,000 years. He's never gone away. Second, he writes beautifully. So if you write, I've had, lucky for me, I've been able to read Cicero in Latin, and it's just gorgeous. It's just the writing. It comes across even in the English translations. He and Seneca, both of them, although they have a different style, and Seneca, by the way, does mention Cicero a number of times in his writings, always kind of in a positive fashion. But Cicero is just a wonderful writer. As I said, the Renaissance humanists thought that Cicero was the model for writing in Latin. They all tried to emulate Cicero. Just as importantly, however, I think that Cicero is interesting to me, and I think should be interesting to people, because he's such a relatable individual. He's not a sage. He's not a perfect human being. He's not a Superman of any kind. He's one of us. You can easily see anybody sort of living that kind of life. He did have a very tumultuous life. As you mentioned, he was alive at the time of Julius Caesar, which means the end of the Roman Republic, which he thought desperately to save from what he perceived as tyranny, which then became, the Roman Empire. But he went through major ups and downs in his life. He came to Rome from outside, so he was an outsider. He was not a part of the senatorial class. And so he was always looked at with suspicion. And yet, when he was very young, he managed to win 2 major court cases, and he was a celebrity overnight, basically. So he became a major figure in Rome when he was very young. He started a political career, and he was elected at all of the major offices that were available in Republic of Rome, including the top one, that of consul, which basically was kind of the equivalent of a co-prime minister or co-president, more likely a co-president in the American model, because the consul really had a lot of power. The 2 consuls had a lot of power in ancient Rome. So he got to the highest peak of his political career. During the time that he's consul, there is a conspiracy to overthrow the state by a senator who was defeated, in fact, by Cicero in the elections, Catiline. And Cicero finds out, and he successfully fights the revolt. And so he's hailed as the father of the land, and all that. And then 2 years later, he's in exile, because his enemies have gotten the upper hand in the Senate. He's sent into exile. They send people after him to assassinate him. So he's now at the nadir, at the opposite, of his life. Then he comes back. He's called back to the Senate, and he comes back to Rome in triumph. And people literally line up on the streets all the way from southern Italy, from Brindisi, where he landed, coming back from Greece, all the way up to Rome, just to salute him and welcome him back. Then, of course, the Civil War starts, and he finds himself on the losing side against Julius Caesar. So he's basically exiled again, not officially, but he's told by Caesar, you really should leave Rome. And so he's fine. Now he's near the end of his life, and he's alone, except for a distant friend, Atticus, who lives in Athens. His political career is in ruin. He cannot practice law because Caesar has closed the courts of law as well. And his daughter, Tullia, dies in childbirth. And this is devastating to him, right? So we recognize him as a human being. The guy is going through all these ups and downs, and he's reacting as you would expect a human being, not a sage, to react. He's very distraught. He's desperate when he's in exile. He's definitely going through a serious depression when his daughter dies. But then he bounces back. And in part, he bounces back thanks to philosophy. He starts writing books. So here's somebody who is in exile. His daughter has died. He has no prospects of either a law career, resuming his law career, or his political career. His country is in shambles. And yet he finds time over a period of 3 years to write a number of books, all of which are classics of ancient philosophy at this point, all of them, right? So the Tuscan disputations, the Stoic paradoxes, one after another. Then he comes back because Caesar, of course, Caesar is killed by the conspirators, right, by Brutus and Cassius and the others. And so there is a short moment where it looks like it's possible to save the Republic. Caesar rushes back to Rome, and he sees very clearly what the next problem is going to be, Mark Antony. Because Mark Antony, after Caesar's death, tries basically to become the next Caesar, to become dictator. And so Cicero writes a series of excoriating speeches against Mark Antony, which he delivers on the floor of the Senate. They're called collectively, they're known as the Philippics, which is an interesting reference. The Philippics is the name of a similar series of speeches that was given by Demosthenes, an Athenian Democrat, against Philip II of Macedon, right? That's why they're called Philippics. And Cicero calls his speeches the Philippics because he thinks he's fighting the same battle that Demosthenes was fighting. Unfortunately, it ended just like the one against Philip II, that is, not well. Mark Antony did not have a sense of humor, so he sends assassins, basically, to soldiers to kill Cicero. Cicero stops his caravan. Basically, he was trying to leave Rome. Well, he was in one of his villas south of Rome. He was trying to leave Italy and go to join his son, who was studying philosophy in Athens. He's, however, surrounded by soldiers, so he stops and he faces his death. Now, keep in mind, Cicero always said that he was not a physically courageous person. He was very frank about admitting his own limitations, especially in the letters that survive with his friend Atticus. And yet, when the end comes, he looks at the soldier who is about to kill him in his eyes, and he says, "There's nothing good about what you're about to do, soldier, but at least do it well. Make sure that you cut my head properly." And then he sticks out his neck, waiting for the sword to fall down. It's like, I don't know about you, but I think that's pretty courageous. So that is why I think Cicero is such a fascinating figure, because he has a way outsized influence on Western history, intellectual history, and political history. He has a fascinating life. He reacts, however, he's very relatable. He reacts to things as a human being would, not a sage, and he writes beautifully. So why not a book on Cicero? In fact, I was surprised when I proposed the book to my agent. I was surprised that nobody had written that kind of book before. And I had the right intuition, because as it turns out, another 2 or 3 books have actually come out in very recently, and there's another one coming out soon on Cicero. So I kind of smelled the right moment, because people's interest in Cicero was clearly on the rebound.
Yeah, and I think you did a great job, like matching the philosophy and the life, and especially setting the historical tone as well, because that really adds to it. You can read Cicero, or you can learn about the philosophy or how he lived, but having that historical background really shows you, as you explained, like what he had to go through and what he had to live with, and also to see, like, okay, this is really a person who experienced it all and went for it because he believed in it, right? And he believed in the cause. Yeah. So he might have called himself not courageous, physically, but at the end, he definitely, I can't even imagine being in a situation, but, and what I would do, I don't know. But I wanted to ask, as we start to wrap things up with, respecting the time as well. And when you read through the book, you have a set of chapters, and it feels like you work from more of the outer world, right? With starting, well, how do we know things, to chapters like how do we build a just society, and at the end you go more into the internal world, right? How do we deal with grief? How do we deal with old age, friendship, and pain and death? Was that like a natural way of sequencing the book, or how did you? Because I think it was fascinating to read it, all those steps, and also kind of matching Cicero's life. What was the idea behind that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So that's exactly the idea that I had in mind. There are always different ways of organizing a book of this kind. You can think of a number of alternative sort of structures. But as you said, that's exactly right. I start with what Cicero himself thought were the two fundamental questions. One is, how do we know anything? If you don't answer that one, then you don't have a starting point, right? Because whatever other statement you're going to make, somebody can reasonably ask you, and how do you know that, right? So you have to be ready to answer that question. And he does, of course, in some of his books. And so that's where I start. Then once you have a general idea of where your knowledge comes from, then the next obvious question is, well, what's most important? What are you going to do in life? What is it that it's really a high priority for you, which it does mostly in the Finibus Bonorum et Malorum, the book that I mentioned earlier. And so that's why the book starts there. Now, because then at that point you could go two ways, I guess. You could go to the personal, to the what you call the interior world, and then out to the social, or the other way around. I decided to do it the other way around, to zoom in gradually. So start with questions such as, what kind of society do we want? What is a just society? How do we build it? To a little bit more personal, what kind of citizens do we want to be? We're a member of society, but we're still individuals. So how do we act within society in a way that is proper, that is conducive to the Stoic ideal of cosmopolitanism and so on and so forth? And then eventually you get more and more personal. So you get to ask questions such as, how important is for me friendship, and how do I cultivate it? To how do I deal with the problems that eventually, unavoidably, everybody has to face, which is grief at losing loved ones or friends or family members, pain and suffering, because even the best life has some degree of pain and suffering. And then finally, of course, your own demise. The last chapter is on death, because that is literally the last chapter that our lives present us with. So I thought it was a logical progression, basically, which the reader might enjoy and benefit. Most importantly, benefit. It's not just a question of enjoyment, but sort of make you think. The idea is, hopefully we're going to all think a little bit more about all these questions, from the big ones to the really personal ones. And as you pointed out, there are also these historical intermezzi, or biographical intermezzi, as I call them, which are these very short chapters about major episodes in the life of Cicero, and of course in what was happening at that time in the Roman Republic. The reason I wanted to do that is because I didn't want to write a biography of Cicero. There is a biography of Cicero out there that came out a number of years ago, and that is excellent, and I highly recommend it. So there's no reason to redo it. I wanted to focus on the philosophy, but the philosophy is not detached from life. Cicero made a project throughout his life of changing and building his philosophy in accordance with what was happening to him personally and to his society, and vice versa, to use his philosophy as a guide to steer the course, so to speak, both in his personal life and in his public life. So I think the whole thing worked out pretty well in that perspective. It's an interesting package that I hope will make people think more, not just about Cicero, but about how to live a life in general, and how to get to the end of it, where you could actually be in a situation of saying, you know what, this was good, and I may be done at this point because of whatever circumstances I find myself in, but this was actually a good thing.
Yeah, no, and I thank you personally for writing the book, because that's exactly what it did, and because you add a lot of contemporary issues there as well, and a lot of personal stories, like on friendship, where you mentioned the three Phils,
Right.
and on
Right.
on grief, and on also on the first question, how do we know anything? The story with your daughter. So I think that really mixes in the contemporary use of what we're actually going through, how to find the facts or how to question everything. That's something that we definitely need right now. So I really appreciate you writing that. And personally, I just love the historical parts because I'm kind of a nerd for those kind of things. So thank you for writing that. And I'd kind of like to wrap it up. I also wanted to ask, like, where can people buy the book? Where can they find you? And definitely, I want to urge people to follow you on the Substack. I think it was Figs in Winter, right? That's the
Figs in
account.
Winter, that's right.
Yeah.
So the book is found everywhere you find books, so both online and in bookstores. I prefer people go to the publisher's website, and then from there they have links to all sorts of retailers. But whatever works for whatever it's easier. The book is available in hard copy, in ebook, and also as a lovely audiobook. It's well read, not by me. There's a professional who's reading the book. As far as Substack is concerned, that's basically my only social medium at the moment. Yes, the Substack newsletter is Figs in Winter, where I kind of keep exploring these ideas. It's about philosophy as a way of life in the broad sense of the term. So hopefully people would enjoy that too.
Yeah, and I think like the same with philosophy have evolved. I think your social media life has also evolved, right? And one last question: what can we expect now in the future from you? Any more books in the pipeline, or?
Yes, of course. There's always something in the pipeline. The next one is not technically a book, although it will come out also as an audiobook. It's an exploration of a number of philosophies of life and religions throughout the world, including Eastern traditions, African philosophy, Mesoamerican philosophy, and of course, Western philosophies. This is going to be a project. It's a video project for the teaching company, the Great Course. There's a series of videos that they call the Great Courses. So it's a course. It's a 24 lectures, video lectures that will be available. I'm working on it right now, and will probably be available by the end of next year. And it will also come out as an audiobook on Audible. And if you purchase it there, it also comes with a printed version of, PDF version basically of the text. I've done 2 of these already for the teaching company. One is about Stoicism, how to think like a Stoic, and the other one is about Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. And they've both been very interesting projects. It's very challenging, it's a different kind of medium, and you have to deal with a video director who tells you to do things one way or another, and that there's a interesting setup that they have when they actually film the video and all that. So it's an interesting project. It's a little bit different from writing a book, although at the end of the day, the full lectures, the text of the full lectures is basically a book of about 100,000 words. So that's a pretty substantial book. Yeah.
Yeah, and they used to print their speeches back in the day as well, right? Cicero.
That's right.
So maybe that could be a nice print as well.
That's right.
But thank you for your time and for writing the book and for having a chat. And hopefully we can, for the next book, we can talk again in the future.
Of course. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.